In the course of setting out to write about the Dragon Age games, I became preoccupied with the prospect of nailing down so many different elements between them. What started as one video turned into 2, then 3, then 5, and 8, and 12, and then I stopped counting. This series is fascinating. It's always drawn out some sincere and strong emotions from me, so I was excited to hear there might be another dimension of it for me to connect with when I found out about the novels. When I was younger, reading fantasy was one of the things that prompted me to imagine that I might like to be a writer when I grew up. So of course, I read every fantasy series I could get my hands on, and high fantasy in particular. Of course, I started with The Lord of the Rings, and I enjoyed material like The Sword in the Stone and Earthsea when I could get it, but a lot of what you read as a kid is always things people get you, and I always begged my mom to take me to the library so I'd take even the pulpier, schlocky fantasy books when I could get them. Naturally, when I found out there were Dragon Age books, I was all over them. The David Gaider novel The Stolen Throne is one of 2 prequels to Dragon Age Origins, and from the first minute I picked it up, I knew exactly what I was getting into. I think the closest comparison would be something like Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy, or T.A. Barron's Merlin saga in terms of reading level accessibility and overall tone and subject matter. It has a perhaps unsurprisingly low barrier for entry for a book about a video game, but not the sort of tone you'd expect for a tie-in to a video game that was rated mature. It does live up to that rating in terms of content, but I suppose fantasy can be like that sometimes. There's an air of something like childishness that goes along strangely but swimmingly with the tragedy, betrayal, romance, and bloodshed rolled into a story like this one. High fantasy benefits sometimes from that tonal clash, especially in stories like this that feature younger protagonists thrust into the wider world with adult responsibilities. That theme is clear from the very beginning. Far off came a muffled answering cry of his pursuers. They had heard him. Merrick lay there in the moonlit shadows, cradling his head. It felt like it was on fire, a raging inferno that blotted out reason. He cursed himself for being so stupid. By sheer luck, if nothing else, he had managed to run some distance into the forest, and now he had given away his location. There was a thick wetness on his fingers. Blood was caking in his hair and running down around his ears and neck, warm in sharp contrast with the frosty air. For a moment he shook, a single sob escaping his lips. Maybe it was best to lie here, he thought. Let them come and kill him, too. They had already killed his mother and earned whatever lavish reward the usurper had surely promised them. What was he, besides an extra body, to be slaughtered along with the 2 few men Mother had brought? And then he froze as a terrible realization settled at the edge of his consciousness. He was the king. The point of view characters in the story are Merrick, Loghain, Rowan, Catriel, and Severin. One of these will be known to players of Dragon Age Origins already, and a second by reputation. Merrick is the heir apparent to the Ferelden throne, Loghain is his close friend, Rowan is his betrothed, Catriel is an elven spy, and Severin is the mage trying desperately to thwart Merrick's rise. Something about David Gaider's style in this book is that, while it's common enough for authors in this genre to use multiple character perspectives in narration within a single chapter, it's also common for authors in this genre to incorporate those shared perspectives while using some kind of line break or significant shift. Gaider does this using an omniscient third-person narration to buffer third-person character perspectives featuring the inner thoughts of those characters. It's not that unusual, but there is a kind of fluidity that both feels right for Dragon Age and also a little bit removing from the characters, not unlike the top-down third-person perspective in the games. The story benefits from multi-perspectivity, although personally I felt its execution clashed somewhat with my desire to fully identify with the feelings and beliefs of the characters, like owning too many pairs of shoes to practically wear and break in, although I understand that's some people's pride and joy. The basic plot is comparatively simple in its structure when compared to the game, but there's a kind of similar flavor to the struggle for succession, especially when compared to the Dwarven noble backstory intro from Dragon Age Origins. There's also a kind of easing in that parallels the game, where the story starts with one character and slowly picks up new ones. By the end, there's just 3 of the 5 remaining, and the plotting and scheming and tactics and strategy and everything else that makes Dragon Age really Dragon Age all comes through, at least in part. Prince Merrick is found by Loghain in the forest in his hour of need. They narrowly escape and are in turn saved by the Dalish and Flemeth, who is a favorite recurring character of mine. They're delivered back to the rebel army and into the hands of Rowan, Merrick's betrothed. There's a lot of material with Rowan and Loghain, especially where we see them in medieval combat situations, and the book makes sure to regularly dip into war strategy and battle tactics, which is another piece of its charm. We get our final characters when Severin contracts Catriel to deliver Merrick to the foreign invaders, and every battle and deception falls into place from there. Nevertheless, the boy is her heir, and he is alive. I need you to get close to him. The elf considered the idea, twirling one of her locks between her fingers thoughtfully. That will take time. Time we have. And are we to negotiate my reward, then? Complete your task first, he said dismissively. Afterwards, King Megrin can and will provide whatever reward you desire. She stood from the bed and bowed again, this time low and servile. Then it seems you have a bard at your disposal, my lord. Severin nodded, pleased. One more chance, then, to destroy the rebellion. In the distance, he heard the muffled sounds of forced laughter in the throne room. The laughter was punctuated by someone screaming in pain, probably for Megrin's amusement. It was the only reason the king delighted in such gatherings. Someone always had to suffer before the night was through. Someone always suffered. One of the strengths of the story that shines through, and one of the things that really convinced me that I was reading a Dragon Age book, was the entangled romances between four of the main characters. Merrick and Rowan are promised to each other. Loghain falls for Rowan. Merrick falls for Catriel. Catriel falls for Merrick despite being sent to kill him. Rowan falls for Loghain despite turning him down. And complicated becomes an understatement. This is where the story comes through the strongest, and because I know a lot of Dragon Age fans play the games in part for the romances, this book will probably satisfy that desire. I sort of wish the romance was more of it, really. The story squeezes a lot of time and drama into a relatively brief and digestible length, so I can understand why it's a bit limited in places, but nevertheless, it's such a strong draw for me that I hope the feeling is relatable. I won't spoil the twist with the relationship dynamics between the characters, because it took me completely off guard, so all I'll say is that it reminded me that sometimes these games are absolute tragedy fests of the highest order. I wonder if David Gator has seen Big Dan Gaming's worst playthrough series of videos. Now, all of that so far is fine, but without the connection to the video games, I wouldn't have felt the story was worth sharing if it wasn't for one specific section in the book. At one point, Catriel's betrayal in part of Merrick in the early days of their relationship involves the rebel army being caught in a major ambush and losing a huge battle. Merrick, Loghain, Rowan, and Catriel all escape the field, but they're cut off from their base of operations with no way to reconnect with their forces. This is where Catriel suggests that the group take a shortcut so that they can evade their enemies and aid their allies. A shortcut that will take them through an abandoned dwarven thaig far below the earth in the place called the Deep Roads. This is by far my favorite section in the book. Maybe it has something to do with being convinced by the Fellowship of the Ring, the Tombs of Atuan, and other strong fantasy stories that dark places underground filled with monsters and mysteries are the peak of tense storytelling. But regardless of that personal bias, I think a lot of other people would see what I see. This is the section of the book where the author drops little hints, just whispers, of what's really underneath the surface of the world of Dragon Age. Pun not intended. Here the webs were everywhere. They hung from building to wall like gentle gauze, and as the cavern rose, the webs seemed to get thicker and thicker until the torchlight couldn't penetrate them any longer. It was as if the webs kept this place cocooned, suspended out of time, in darkness and quiet. Careful, Loghain warned softly, moving his torch so as not to light the webs. Such a blaze would have spread quickly into the upper reaches of the thaig, and likely brought all of it raining down upon their heads. "Do you feel it?" Rowan asked, stepping uncertainly forward amid the uneven debris. She touched her cheek and looked around with concern. The others opened up their eyes wide, feeling the same thing she did. A gentle brush on their cheeks, the slightest sense of movement in the dust-choked air. "It's air," Merrick breathed. "There's air flowing here." He was right. Air was coming from somewhere high up, and if they looked carefully, they could see the faint glowing webs wavering ever so slightly overhead. Perhaps there was some sort of hole leading to the surface. The dwarves must have had chimneys of some kind, or perhaps these were the ducts that Catriel had mentioned. There were also sounds. As the four of them stood there, the distant clicking became more prominent. It started and stopped, but it was definitely there. After hearing little else but their own movements, such alien sounds were very easy to notice. Catriel blanched, her fear made noticeable by her agitated glances up into the darkness despite her effort to conceal it. What are those sounds? Rocks? Nobody answered her. Even she didn't really believe it. This part of the story takes a lot of the strengths noted earlier and places them in proximity to a dual sense of danger and intrigue. This is peak Dragon Age storytelling right here in this couple of chapters. I'm excited for the sequel because, as I understand it, the core of the plot involves returning to this part of the world of Thedas and features at least one of the same characters. It gives me the distinct sensation of being a kid, having a balanced meal, and imagining what it would be like to eat only your dessert. There's a particular touching section where our four main protagonists are trapped together in the deep roads in the darkness, and they need to tread carefully and find comfort in the irregular relationships they've formed with each other. I think it says something powerful that the author chose to situate a story about a prince's right of succession in a war for independence in the personal lives of the people he cares about. The conflict feels a little bit more personal, almost like it isn't a war at all, and while I think I can see the appeal of thinking in terms of the reverse, there's also something about the medieval fantasy setting that makes this decision fitting. Merrick wants justice for his mother, his friends, and his kingdom, but we as the reader understand that liberation from oppression, such as it is, will be limited, especially if we've played later games. As opposed to wallowing in the futility of that struggle, David Gator instead grounds it in the emotionality of the individual people who nevertheless live that struggle. I think there's something poetic about that. As I acknowledged in the beginning of this essay, it isn't really the quality of the prose that kept me glued to the pages at this point. This was the section when I decided I actually really liked this book, as opposed to just finding it passable, but rather it's the subject and the manner in which the author treats it. The text is incredibly accessible, which is a huge strength if you consider the function of a book like this to be its appeal on the basis of tying into and resembling the Dragon Age video games. I always prefer to evaluate adaptations and tie-ins on their own merits and in multiple different contexts, because the landscape in which a reader might encounter a book like this is shifting all the time, and I think the goals and values we often ascribe to adaptations can be limiting to artists. However, there is something to be said for knowing your audience and delivering, and I think David Gator hits the mark with this one. This book made me glad to own it, which isn't a universal quality even for a bibliophile, and it has me hooked and wanting to read more in the series even as I explore the games. Hopefully, this has meant something to you as well. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and check out David Gator's Dragon Age: The Stolen Throne if you want to experience it for yourself.